afternoon all, and thank you for attending my CPD session where we'll be exploring and applying narrative theory in the English classroom. So, the objectives for this session are to understand what narratology is and its core concepts, appreciate the importance of narrative theory in literary analysis and teaching, learn how narratology can deepen students' understanding of texts, and explore practical strategies for applying narratology in the classroom. We're going to begin with a definition of narratology. Narratology is the ensemble of theories related to narratives, including text, images, spectacles, and cultural artifacts that tell a story. It aims to help with understanding, analysing, and evaluating narratives. So let's explore why narratology is essential, particularly in the classroom. Firstly, it develops analytical skills by helping students analyse narrative techniques like structure, vocalization, and narrators, thereby deepening their understanding of text. It also fosters critical thinking by encouraging us to question why and how stories are told, enhancing interpretation. Additionally, it improves writing by allowing students to experiment with narrative techniques in their own writing, making it more complex and engaging. And finally, it builds empathy by encouraging students to understand multiple perspectives through different narrative viewpoints. So when we're teaching core concepts of narratology, there are several things that we need to consider. First, clear definitions. We need to start by providing simple, concise definitions of each concept in narratology, explaining terms in a way that connects to students' prior knowledge. We must also include concrete examples by using relatable and varied examples to demonstrate each concept, ensuring they're linked to real-world applications or subjects the students are familiar with. Next, we could try to incorporate some visual aids by using diagrams or charts, any sort of visuals to help students better understand abstract ideas. These visual representations often clarify complex relationships within narratology. Including interactive practice such as group exercises or problem-solving tasks allows students to apply concepts actively. This engages students and helps reinforce their understanding. And finally, checking for understanding is important. Regularly asking questions or using quick assessments to gauge students' comprehension and address any misconceptions on the spot. Now I'm going to introduce some core concepts that I think are important to teach within the English classroom. They're applicable to all key stages, and I do want to apologise in advance. I'm sure you already know them and you already know the definitions, but I wanted to show you how I would go about defining them, how I would use comparison to get students to understand the definitions properly, and also give you some examples. So the first core concept is narrative structure. I'm going to explore 3 narrative structures that students will benefit from being exposed to. The first one is linear, where the story is told in straight chronological order from beginning to end. When teaching this, I will provide a comparison by saying it's a bit like reading a diary from start to finish, where each entry follows the previous one in order. I might also give the example of the novel Pride and Prejudice and explain the events that take place in linear order. The next narrative structure is non-linear, where the story is not told in chronological order and might jump around in time. I would explain that it's a bit like a puzzle where you have to piece together different parts of the image that are scattered around. I might use Jekyll and Hyde as an example. So we're going to stop for a second and I have a task for you. So I want you to imagine you're teaching a short story that has a non-linear structure where events are revealed out of chronological order. Some students are struggling to follow the plot. I want you to think about how you could adapt your teaching to help them engage with this structure. So if you're a bit stuck, maybe consider how you might use graphic organisers or plot mapping to support comprehension, or how you could use questioning to guide students towards understanding the author's purpose behind a non-linear narrative. Pause the video and take as much time as you need thinking about this. So moving forward, we have a cyclical narrative structure where the story ends where it began, creating a circular structure. Explain that this is a bit like a song that ends with the same verse it started with, bringing you back to the beginning. And you might introduce them to or recap the events that take place in Blood Brothers. Finally, we have a framed narrative structure, which is a story within a story where the main narrative is set within another narrative. You might explain that it's a bit like a picture within a picture where the main image is surrounded by another image. So now that we've looked at these 4 different narrative structures, I want you to reflect on a text that you've taught recently. Think about what type of narrative structure it uses and how did you approach this in the classroom. So you might want to consider whether the structure impacted how your students understood the plot or themes, and how could you adjust your teaching to make this structure more accessible or engaging for students. I've now provided some examples of tasks that could be completed during lessons for both reading and writing. I won't read through all the ideas, so feel free to pause the video, but the ones that I've highlighted are text comparison, where you compare the linear structure of one text with the non-linear structure of another. Analysis of cyclical structure, where you read a short story with a cyclical structure and discuss how starting and ending at the same point shapes the themes. Non-linear flashback analysis, where you explore a text with flashbacks and analyse how the non-linear structure builds suspense or reveals character motivations. And rearranging the narrative as a writing task, where you provide students with a simple story in random order and ask them to organise it into linear or non-linear sequence. So these tasks I've personally used in the classroom and I find extremely beneficial. And the great thing about them is that they can be completed as a class or in groups, and the engagement is always high. The next core concept that I think is important to explore is narrative voice. Usually, especially when looking at structure, students are taught to identify whether texts are written in first or third person. However, I believe it's more beneficial to identify the omniscient and the unreliable narrator. Whether analysing these types of narrative voice in texts or creating these voices in their own writing, students should be able to identify the differences and the purposes of these narrative voices. In terms of perspective and knowledge, the omniscient narrator has a comprehensive and all-knowing perspective, while the unreliable narrator has a limited or biased perspective. In terms of their roles in storytelling, the omniscient narrator often serves to present a complete and coherent view of the story, whereas the unreliable narrator can introduce complexity and depth, encouraging readers to engage more deeply with the text to uncover hidden meanings. When looking at trustworthiness, the omniscient narrator is typically considered trustworthy and authoritative, providing a clear and accurate depiction of the story, whereas the unreliable narrator is not inherently trustworthy, and readers must critically evaluate the narrative to uncover the truth themselves. Finally, in terms of narrative influence, the omniscient narrator can guide the reader's understanding by providing context and insights that characters may not have, whereas the unreliable narrator can create suspense and ambiguity, prompting the readers to question and interpret the narrative more actively. So now what I want you to do is I want you to think about how you've approached teaching narrative voice in your lessons. If you haven't, think about how you would. So things you might want to think about is, how do you help students differentiate between reliable and unreliable narrators, or how would you? How might you introduce omniscient narration to make it clearer for students? And what challenges have your students faced in understanding narrative voice, or what challenges do you think that your students would face? So I'm now going to provide you with some reading and writing activities that could help apply knowledge of narrative voice. I've incorporated the highlighted texts and tasks in my own lessons. So these are Spot the Lies, Reading the Telltale Heart, and identifying moments where the narrator's unreliability becomes apparent. I've looked at the yellow wallpaper before and analysed how the narrator's mental state affects her reliability. And in terms of writing, I've got my students to change the point of view, where they take a previously written first-person story and rewrite it using an omniscient narrator. The final core concept is focalization. In narratology, focalization refers to the perspective through which a narrative is presented. It concerns the lens or viewpoint from which the events of a story are perceived and conveyed to the audience. While focalization is often confused with point of view, they are distinct. Point of view refers to the voice or position of the narrator, for example, first or third person, while focalization refers to the perspective or scope of what the narrator knows or reveals. The most important thing to know about focalization is that it controls the reader's access to information. By limiting or expanding what is revealed through particular focalizers, the author can create suspense, build empathy, or lead the reader towards certain interpretations. It also shapes the narrative experience, as a story can feel different depending on whose perceptions or knowledge the narrative focuses on. Finally, it creates layers of meaning by switching between different types of focalization or different characters' perspectives. An author can offer multiple viewpoints on the same event, enriching the narrative complexity. So what I'd like you to do now is imagine you're teaching a novel with multiple focalized perspectives. How would you approach this to ensure students understand the shifts in focalization and its effect on the reader's experience? So things you could consider is how you could use visual aids to help students track shifts in focalization, and also what questions you would pose to students to help them evaluate the purpose of changing perspectives. Maybe also consider what text you would actually use. So I've provided you with some reading and writing activities that would help students to apply their knowledge of focalization. So the following tasks that I've highlighted are examples that I've used in my lessons as well. So we've got shifted perspectives, where I've read Wonder before and analysed how different characters' perspectives offer multiple views of the same events. I've looked at The Great Gatsby with my Key Stage 5 class and examined how Nick's perspective shapes the reader's view of Gatsby and other characters. And for writing, these two tasks I've actually used with Key Stage 5 as well, where we've had students write the same scene twice, once from one character's perspective and then from another, and where they've written a story where the focalization comes from a peripheral observer rather than the main character. And these are tasks that really help prepare them for the actual exam. So we've now come to the end of this session, but before I go, I just wanted to list a few things to consider when teaching these concepts of narratology. First of all, we should consider the ability of each class and tailor tasks to match students' skill levels so everyone can participate, supporting those who need it and challenging those who are more advanced. Additionally, scaffolding is important, providing step-by-step help to build understanding, breaking down complex ideas and gradually reducing support as students become more confident will allow them to gradually become more independent in naturally incorporating these concepts in their writing and identifying them in texts. Try to make tasks relate to students' interests where possible and their lives to keep them engaged and make the learning meaningful. Finally, in terms of curriculum, ensure tasks meet the learning goals and standards of the GCSE, Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 5 curriculum so students develop the necessary skills and knowledge for their assessments. Thank you so much for attending this session. Bye.